No man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature is in session.
HB 150 Emergency Water Shortage Amendments.
A emergency water situation. It's a bill that's been very difficult. It's a necessity. If we have an emergency and a water right is taken, the bill hopefully will never ever be used.
The people govern us. We're servants of the public.
We'll open up to the public for comment. U11 can speak. Is there anyone online? Oh, geez.
It is not within the right of the government to make decisions as to who can receive water and who cannot. We have seen how emergencies have been abused in the past. The governor can sign an executive order to declare a temporary water shortage emergency.
This bill does not give the authority to the governor. He already has it. This bill does not give the authority to the governor. He already has it.
Nothing lasts longer than a temporary government program. Does a man-made disaster also include the funneling of water to the Great Salt Lake for lithium production? Also, the exorbitant amount of water used for data centers and for the high-density housing? There's a lot of water being misused. Water is a property right and a natural right to obtain from the land. To take this right from the people is a violation of Article 1, Section 1 of the state constitution.
No man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature is in session. That's a quotation from Gideon John Taylor. He's a New York judge in 1866. And I'm absolutely appalled at what happens every single year in Utah as we run these things. We should be appalled that they're even claiming that they have these authorities. And that's one of the ways we got into this huge problem 3 years ago when the Utah legislature had previously, now this is again, they set it up, we hope we never get to use this, but the governor was delegated, if you will, authority from the legislature to legislate in an emergency. He himself declared this is the very definition of tyranny. And this is exactly where we're being set up again today. So as we talked late this afternoon, early this evening, I thought, wow, I've got this other presentation, but this is real time. This is on our mind. So I thought we'd at least introduce it. Perhaps we can discuss it at greater length because there wasn't time to adequately bring every constitutional issue into this. I put together back in the summer of 2020, some impeachment resolutions to impeach our governor over these things because it was an absolute violation of constitutional everything. So, but nobody in the legislature would even carry it. So here we go, emergency orders in Utah. We have in our constitution what we could consider an emergency operations clause. It's quite specific, it's constitutionally defined, and people need to get it out and read it, because it says specifically the governor can't do these kinds of things where he legislates based upon an emergency. So we'll get to that pretty quickly. But because we ignored the things that are in our Constitution, we had this disastrous pandemic response and the state's leadership foisted it upon us. They further added insult to injury when they met in the multiple special sessions that spring, where they shoveled off additional power with no consequences to anyone. And it really was a complete disaster because people are unaware of what their limits and bounds are. So it should have resulted in impeachment. The great bulk of the executive branch should have been removed from office. And then the electors, us, the voters, we the people, should have removed virtually all legislators from our legislature the following election cycle, if we were paying attention. Sadly, eternal vigilance is the price for liberty, and we very rarely get into that. So before we look at the specific statements in the Utah Constitution, we got to review again a few fundamental principles that are pertaining to this. Source number one is our rights. Where do these come from? Oh, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. We're endowed by our Creator with these rights. It's fundamental to everything that came after this point, a recognition that God is the source of our rights. Point one. Point two, why do we have government? Well, back to the Declaration again. To secure these God-given rights, governments are instituted among men. That's the purpose of government, to preserve God-given rights. And if we get to the Utah Constitution, if we can figure out how to bring that up or at least read it to you, we find that all of these things, the right to property and due process and all those things, are both in the United States fundamental documents as well as specifically in the Utah Constitution. So point number three, or principle number three, is the origin of authority to govern. Again, back to the Declaration of Independence. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, we're going to have integrated in here a few quotations from different individuals that I think had a pretty good handle on these kind of things. I'm going to start with Thomas Jefferson. Our ancient laws expressly declare that those who are but delegates, that's the ones that are in the representative jobs in the legislatures, governors and senators and everybody else, themselves shall not delegate to others powers which require judgment and integrity in their exercise. The same laws forbid the abandonment of that post even on ordinary occasions, but much more, a transfer of their powers into the hands and other forms without consulting the people. Necessities which dissolve the government. So this is an emergency. Boy, I guess we can suddenly say we're going to change the way we do business. Do not convey its authority to an oligarchy or a monarchy or a governor or anything else like that, you might say. They throw back into the hands of the people a power they had delegated and leave them as individuals to shift for themselves. A leader may offer, but not impose himself, nor be imposed on them. So these delegated authorities, these powers that are given by the consent of the governed, cannot just be willy-nilly, arbitrarily shifted about because, oh, by golly, we've got an emergency. Let's try this. It doesn't work that way. So the consent of the governed is required. And we need to remember that the consent of the governed is obtained through the constitutional ratification process. Through that process, the people agreed to abide by laws created by trusted representatives within the limits and bounds which are constitutionally defined. Okay, so the consent of the governed is not obtained through the elective process. We don't, every time we have an election, decide to give our consent of the governed, and that suddenly they can go and do whatever they willy-nilly choose to do. The elective process only allows people to select their representatives who will act within the constitutional limits already established constitutionally, okay? So these representatives can't change the rules of engagement. They cannot say they're there doing our will. All they're there to do is fulfill their office within the limits and bounds of their oath of office. So, principle 4, authority to govern may be withdrawn. Oh, by golly, we go back to that Declaration of Independence. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. So the people retain the right to alter or abolish their government. We can go to Article 1 of the Utah Constitution, which talks about the people at the source of these things. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do that. But in the United States Constitution, we have a specific article that says, here's how we change it. And the people can give their authority again. But there's no other means to change the Constitution. It can't be done by legislative enactment. And hopefully as we get through this, you're kind of tucking away some of these little tidbits to see where all of this effort today even to grab power is a violation of these fundamental principles. George Washington said, the basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people is sacredly obligatory upon all. He said, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates, but let no change by usurpation. See, here's the problem. The Constitution of the United States or of Utah has not been changed to allow a governor to become the grand poobah of all things. There are limits and bounds that are placed upon a president or a governor or even a legislature. They cannot just decide they're going to make modifications. Let's look at what Noah Webster said about a constitution. He said, in free states, the Constitution is paramount to the statutes or laws enacted by the legislature, limiting and controlling its power. Here's what paramount means. It's superior, highest title, jurisdiction, eminent, highest order, superior, chief, highest in rank or order. That means the Constitution is the top of the stack in terms of our legal definition of what may or may not be done. So the Constitution has to override any of the grand plans of any legislator or legislature or any governor or any appointee. The Constitution prevails and it sets limits and bounds. Well, states and all governments are constrained and bounded by the same principles we've just been talking about in the Declaration of Independence. These principles regarding government are not to be applied only to a national or general government. They apply regardless of the jurisdiction of the government we're speaking about. They apply to the general government, that to some people is the national or the federal government, to a state government, to a county government, and to municipalities. All levels of government have got to operate within those bounds. And Utah has a constitution. It defines and limits the actions of those who are to become our representatives. So the legislature, again, can't just say, by golly, we got a real tough spot we're in, so we're going to change the rules of engagement. They're out of bounds in every way. The consent of the governed to be governed within the limits and bounds defined within the Constitution is obtained through their ratification of our Utah Constitution, just like it was in the United States Constitution. And the representatives that are there, they take an oath to be bound to the limits defined within the Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. So those in the state of Utah may not govern outside those parameters, or they violate their oaths of office. Again, here a couple, 2 or 3 years ago, I felt like everybody ought to be removed from office because nobody was standing up to what needed to be done. Let's go to principle number 5, separation of powers or divided powers. The legislature has the power to make laws. Nobody else can. Well, in Utah, we're going to find that under special circumstances, the people can do that through a process that's defined in the Constitution. But the governor cannot make laws. He has the power to carry out and enforce the laws, but those laws have all got to be created within the limits and bounds of the Constitution. And as we find out, even if the legislature claims to be delegating to the governor the authority to make law, it can't be done. And the Constitution precludes that, by the way. Then the judicial judges, situations where laws have been broken and so on. Well, we know human nature is to seek, obtain, and then abuse power. Founding fathers understood this, and others recognized it. And here's a couple of them. Lord Acton, the British philosopher, said power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Daniel Defoe said all men would be tyrants if they could. You've also heard the saying, it's the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they begin to exercise the term unrighteous dominion. That is the nature, that is human nature. So within a constitution, it limits and bounds that. It says, here's how far you may go and no further. All entities retain and act within their specific jurisdiction. Here's what Jefferson said. In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. That's why we got to get the Constitution out and read it over. I know there's a lot of problems in the Utah Constitution because the progressives of the era it was written in leveraged their good old boy college years into getting some of it into Utah's constitution, but there are things that we can stand by, and we should and we must, or we're going to be denied the freedoms that are still vouchsafed in there. Here's Madison saying the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary. Oh, wait a minute. So if the governor decides to make law and then enforce the law, or what if there was instead of a Bureau of Land Management, a Division of Land Management, can we say accumulation of all powers, where they legislate, they execute, and they are the judiciary that looks at how everything's handed out. It's in the same hands, whether one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. That is exactly what our Utah legislature constantly is wrangling to perform, and they should be protecting the legislative power that is in their hands instead of handing it out or presuming to hand it out, which they can't do. That's the next point we've got. Delegated powers may not be redelegated once they were granted by the people through the constitutional process. One of the principal mentors, if you will, of the American founding fathers was a guy that came before them and put together a lot of magnificent things that ended up being incorporated in our Constitution, along with Blackstone and with Montesquieu. You can find these things woven into our Declaration and our Constitution. It is absolutely, their fingerprints are all over this. But here's what John Locke said about redelegating power. He said, the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws into any other hands. They can't do it. They can't hand it off. For it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others. The people alone can appoint the form of the Commonwealth, which is by constituting the legislative and appointing into whose hands that shall be. And when the people have said, we will submit and be governed by laws made by such men and in such forms, nobody else can say other men shall make laws for them, like a governor or a health department or whatever, nor can they be bound by any laws, but such as are enacted by those whom they have chosen and authorized to make laws for them. No, wait a minute. This law is going to say the governor and some bureaucrat, I guess, that has some water background is going to be able to tell us who and how we can use our water. So a simpler way was put by St. George Tucker. A delegated authority cannot be transferred to another to exercise. I always introduce him as the premier or preeminent constitutional scholar of the founding era. So powers that have been delegated by the people to the government may not be redelegated, in spite of the fact they presume to do that by passing legislation. Okay. When these principles are ignored or violated, tyranny is being implemented upon the nation. Simple as that. But these happen constantly in Utah. It's absolutely astounding to me how it just seems like there is hardly a moment that passes, especially when they're in legislative session or special session, as they keep calling themselves into. Thomas Jefferson said the single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions begun at the distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers to plainly prove a deliberate, systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. And I have to ask myself, if we have 1,000 bills or whatever it ends up being in this legislative session, do we really need 1,000 more laws? This is not just a water law. Yes, we're talking about water law, current events right now, but these 1,000 bills, or if we just pass half of them, do we need 500 new bills, new laws every year? You multiply that by 10, you multiply that by 100. I mean, pretty soon there's hardly an aspect of our lives that is not being regulated. So let's go now to the Utah Constitution. I'm skipping completely Article 1 because I'd almost have to put it in its entirety about private property and due process. Those silly things about having to, be able to be protected in all of these things. They're not silly, by the way. That's a kind of a get you thinking kind of comment. But let's go to Article 5, Section 1. There are 3 departments of government in Utah. They're divided into three departments: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. No person charged with the exercise of powers properly belonging to one of these departments shall exercise any functions appertaining to either of the others, except in cases herein, notice the emphasis there, expressly directed or permitted. So unless the Constitution, that's herein, says you can do differently, this is the rules of engagement: legislative, executive, and judicial. And you can't swap hands with that unless within the Constitution. And then we're going to see where somebody might have interpreted it that way. They'll say, nope, you still can't violate the Constitution. We'll get that in just a moment. So Article 6, Section 1, the powers vested in Senate, House, and the people. Legislative power of the state shall be vested in a Senate, House of Representatives, and the people. Again, that's under certain circumstances that's outlined further in the Constitution. The people may create law directly. Okay, that generally is a bad approach to things. But again, that's a wink and a nod to the progressives that were in vogue in the days that the Constitution was written. Okay, here comes a big one. This one's going to take us a couple of slides. This is called continuity of government. Notwithstanding any general or special provisions of the Constitution, in order to ensure continuity of state and local government operations when such operations are seriously disrupted as a result of natural or man-made disaster. Whoa, wait a minute. That's what they say this new water bill may be done: natural or man-made disaster, or disaster by an enemy attack. The legislature may. Okay. A, provide for prompt and temporary succession to the powers and duties of any elected or appointed public office, the incumbents of which may become unavailable for carrying out the powers and duties of such offices. And maybe they got killed in the earthquake, or maybe the enemy attack nuked a few or something like that. So they weren't available anymore. But they can be succeeded promptly and temporarily for the carrying out of the powers and duties of such offices, and going on, adopt measures necessary and proper for ensuring the continuity of government operations, including, but not limited to, the financing thereof. So they can still spend money, which is kind of a little dangerous, isn't it? But this subsection 2, which I have bolded, is what I really wanted to focus on this, because we do have, they thought about it. If things go upside down and backwards, we got to keep the government running, right? Okay, so subsection 2 says 1 above, go back to where we just read that, does not permit these temporary public officers to act, or these temporary measures to be contrary to the Constitution and applicable law. Read that again. You can't violate the Constitution even if it's an emergency. And even if you've created a law which the Constitution supersedes, if the law is contrary to the Constitution, it is not lawful. We need to go back and review that. Here's the next, Article 7, Section 5. Executive powers vested in the governor, duties, and legal counsel. The executive power of the state shall be vested in the governor, who shall see that the laws are faithfully executed. Premier, paramount, superior to, all of those is the Utah Constitution. So in spite of the fact that some years ago, the Utah legislature decided that if the governor declared an emergency, oh, wow, look how much power I have. If I'm the governor and I declare the emergency, suddenly he's a legislator and he can do that. It's not the way it's written in the Constitution.